Manuel was holding a meeting between him and his council, discussing the assignment of governors to the eastern provinces, when a battered soldier stormed into the room. He told Manuel of Gregorius' failed arrest, and Alorison's consolidation of the east. Manuel said nothing and blankly stared away into the distance. He tapped his finger onto the table and his jaw was clenched. The battered soldier nervously looked around and asked him what was to be done about the situation. He was cut off by Manuel, who at last spoke. "I have done nothing but serve my people diligently, Photius. I was handed down a broken empire, and I did what I could, given the circumstances." Manuel looked at his soldier and shook his head. That man was responsible for the death of thousands in Bulgaria. Yet his soldiers marched with him. "We have the armies of Greece at hand, sir. You're worrying too much about this." Manuel looked Photius in the eye. "A man that has gotten as lucky as he has is no man to underestimate." Manuel stood and looked at a painting depicting Constantine Palaiologos. "We may not live to see his dream realized." "Whose dream, sir?" Manuel gazed at Constantine's eyes. "I'm not sure. And that is what scares me." Following Gregorius' failed arrest, the entire East rose up in revolt against Manuel. Gregorius' army of the damned were eager to prove their worth, and thanks to Isaac Melodus, they were on their way to outclass Manuel's armies in terms of discipline. Gregorius appointed men loyal to him as governors of the Anatolian provinces. The cities captured in the crusade were given a Roman administration, and unlike Constantine's policy towards captured settlements, the nobility were stripped of their rank and wealth, having it seized by Gregorius and his officials. To appease the locals, he redistributed the belongings of the old Turkish nobility to the people, assuring that they wouldn't be so quick to revolt the moment he left for Greece. Along with the appointment of governors, Gregorius established a committee based in Osakion, which would function as a temporary government for as long as Gregorius saw fit. With things settled, Gregorius finally left for Greece, bringing with him an army of 6,000 men he had assembled during the crusade. Almost half of his army was composed of Romans, but the other half was a mixture of Turkish, Italian, and Germanic soldiers. Much like the crusading army he had commanded before, he would make up for his numbers in discipline and expertise, relying on his soldiers' harsh training by Isaac and some Hungarian officers who had defected from the crusade and joined his army in exchange for passage back home. On his way to Constantinople, Gregorius stopped at Nicomedia, which had been riddled with Manuel's loyalists, and ordered a crackdown of the local government. Unlike the cities captured in the crusade, Gregorius was met with fierce opposition from the people, who were instigated to riot by the nobles. The governor headquarters was surrounded, and nearly stormed, but Gregorius was able to slip away, and ordered his soldiers to quell the riot by any means necessary. This left Nicomedia engulfed in flames and its population severely diminished. He let his soldiers take whatever they could find and claim it as their own. This further cemented the loyalty of his soldiers and horrified Manuel's court in Greece, who rallied the emperor to do something and stamp out Gregorius' revolt before things could get further out of hand. Gregorius sent scouts to the Bosphorus and scoped out Constantinople's naval defenses. He found that Manuel sent Thessaloniki and Athenian ships to patrol the area. He instead moved his army south and planned to cross into Greece through the Dardanelles Strait. On his way there, he stopped a few miles away from Cius and took a look around the area. Isaac Melodus asked Gregorius for the reason of the army's halt, and was met with silence. Gregorius closed his eyes and smiled. Though no one could have guessed, Gregorius was standing on the graves of Constantine Palaiologos' former bodyguards. It had been 16 years since Constantine's assassination, and the removal of Ilinos as the next in line. He kicked the ground and continued the march to Abydos, cursing Constantine and Vitrinus for having tried to deny him of his fate. They didn't see things the way he did. They clung to delusional hopes of building a new Rome that would see its people and emperor work together to make a better future for their descendants, as if such a thing was even remotely possible. The people were flawed. They only cared for their interests and were easily led by those who told them what they wanted to hear. This cynical way of thinking was what made Gregorius embark on his path to become emperor. If he had let Reuben or Zolan get close to him, he would have strayed from his life's work, and would never get the opportunity to set the Roman people on the right path. If he told them what he truly believed, would they have accepted him? Would they have understood him? Or would they have just been the ones to cut off contact with him? That fear of rejection riddled Gregorius' mind. Since he was a child, he was rejected by those who were supposed to be his family and his community. The priests and villagers who held the funerals for Agnes and Claudia refused to let him see his loved ones one final time. They told him to toughen up, to get used to dealing with loss, which filled him with resentment and the utmost hatred of his fellow man. Gregorius' army began to cross into Greece. 3,000 men along with Gregorius managed to get through without issue, but coincidentally at the very same time a Roman army under the control of Photius was marching to Abydos and planned to launch the invasion of the Anatolian provinces from there. Scouts from both sides raced back to their commanders, and a battle was imminent. Gregorius drew his soldiers into defensive formation, and had nearby trees cut down to make hastily sharpened stakes. The stakes were placed in front of his infantry, and served to prevent the enemy from performing any devastating cavalry charge. Gregorius joined his men in the front, and eagerly awaited Photius' men. He made sure to show no fear, and told his soldiers that even if they were outnumbered, the enemy lacked the resolve and courage, raising his men's spirits. Photius' army came into view and they began to advance on Gregorius' position. The cavalry, seeing the stakes placed before them, were forced to sit out the battle, and waited on the sidelines for the eventual victory, confident in their ability to repel the rebel army. The Roman heavy infantry attacked Gregorius' center, and slowly pushed them back towards the coast, but Gregorius' presence kept them fighting. He told them to hold out for the reinforcements that were still crossing, having the makeshift standard from the crusade wave frantically in the view of all of his men. Gregorius' army let out a fanatical war cry and began to push Photius' men back. With the reinforcements having crossed, Gregorius had the men on the sides begin advancing forward and shoot the enemy on the side with the arquebuses. Photius' front line, thinking a much larger army had landed and were going to envelop them, began to break rank and dispersed. Photius wouldn't accept defeat, however, and rallied his cavalry to finally attack Gregorius' army, now that they were beyond the stakes vicinity. Acting fast, Gregorius ordered all of his spearmen to the front and split his arquebusiers, making them line up on each flank, having them place small wooden stakes in front of them. Photius was unfazed by Gregorius' attempt to save his army, and proceeded with his charge. Photius' cavalry was riddled with arrows and bullets, but remained steadfast. The impact of the initial charge devastated Gregorius' spearmen, and they began to cede ground. They kept pushing the Romans back and were on the brink of routing his men, but Photius had pushed too deep. Isaac and Gregorius moved the heavy infantry to the sides and enveloped Photius and his men, killing everyone and taking no prisoners. Gregorius had the armor and belongings of the enemy redistributed to his men, and they marched straight to Thessaloniki. He recruited peasants en masse and offered them their own land should they join him, bolstering his numbers from 6,000 men to 9,000. They were to serve as his cannon fodder, while the more experienced men under his command waited for the enemy to wear themselves down, and then they would attack when the time was right. In essence, it was a return to the Roman maniple system with the pike and shot hybridization. Gregorius' dream of a reinvented Roman army was finally taking place, and how fitting was it that it was in the midst of a civil war. Manuel's court in Thessaloniki panicked at the news of Gregorius' victory against Photius, sending the city into a frenzy that was only quelled by Manuel's promise of a relief army, making its way from Pharsalus. Gregorius sent a letter to Sidorocastro's barracks, and asked the commanders to join him before it was too late, but they refused, reading the letter out loud to their men to make fun of the Larissan. This jab at Gregorius backfired, as the newly conscripted recruits were moved by his words, and took him up on his offer of free land to join his army, bolstering his 9,000 to 10,000 men. When Manuel received news of this, he angrily stormed out of his palace and took with him his belongings. Manuel was forced to abandon Thessaloniki and retreated south to Athens, where the Moravian armies were close at hand. He stopped by Larissa, and his retinue was wary, being eyed down by the locals who had openly expressed their support for Gregorius throughout the crusade. Manuel cut his visit to Larissa short, and quickly fled to his destination. Gregorius heard of Manuel's flight and sent Isaac on ahead to Larissa, Pharsalus, Nicopolis, and a fort nearby to announce the emperor's abandonment of his people, offering to welcome them with open arms should they turn on Manuel. The nobles and the cities refused Gregorius' offer, and began making preparations for potential sieges, garrisoning their cities with soldiers from their respective thematic armies. The lowest recruits in the armies, however, didn't see a point in fighting for nobles who had done nothing for them, and began defecting to Gregorius' banner. Thessaloniki, severely unequipped to weather a siege, opened its gates, and fell into the control of the Gregorian army. Gregorius met with the inhabitants of the city, and made a show of remorse for having been pushed to engage in civil war. He asked the civilians to put themselves in his shoes, and reminded them that the defeat of the Roman army in 1480 was now behind them, thanks to him and those who chose to follow him during the crusade. Gregorius asked the lower class populace what the nobility had done for them recently. Something no one in the crowd could answer. He nodded understandingly and turned to Isaac. He told the populace that should they wish to join him in its revolt against Manuel, they were free to do so, but warned that supporting the nobility in any plot to backstab him would be met with, quote, intense retaliation. He then left Thessaloniki and marched to Pharsalus, much to the confusion of Isaac and the Larissans. Gregorius told Isaac that he was not going to treat Larissa any differently than Iconium or Constantinople. Much like Diocletian with the city of Rome, he disdained anyone from Larissa. They were not going to embrace him now that he was making something out of himself. They had their chance when he was a child. In Pharsalus, Gregorius spent the following months training his new recruits, personally overseeing the drilling exercises and participating in them as well. He'd examined his victory at Abydos, and with the help of Germanic and Italian commanders, devised a general strategy they would use from then on. The Roman army would ditch their standardized spears for pikes, and adopt a defensive approach when engaging a hostile force, even if they were the aggressors. The pikemen would draw up in the first row in 3 columns and spaced out to give the arquebusiers and cannons on the second row space to fire their weapons. In order to prevent the enemy cavalry from charging straight into the arquebusiers, they were to be reinforced by crossbowmen who were equipped with stakes, and in between reloading their guns, the crossbowmen would provide cover fire. The third column would be filled with heavy infantry who were equipped to deal with enemy forces that had either breached the first line or directly charged into the arquebusiers. On both sides of the third column, the Roman cavalry were moderately armored, and their purpose was to circle around the enemy and charge into the rear given the chance, moving away from the heavy cavalry of the 10th and 11th centuries in favor of a stronger infantry, which would wither down the enemy. The main purpose of the battle was not to win, but to survive, and take as much of the enemy down before the day was over. Of course, not every battle was expected to go according to this strategy, but it was a start from the broken armies of 1453 through 1480, which had borrowed its strategy from mercenary captains, or the rare capable commander the Romans just so happened to have at the time, i.e. Vetranus or Laurentius Becos. Gregorius also began the production of standardized armor for 2,000 of his best soldiers, and he equipped the thematic armies with flags of their barracks, which would cement an identity for the soldiers. An identity they were missing for a long time. An identity of a professional army. Gregorius set out of Pharsalus in late June of 1485 and began making way for Athens. Here he would learn that Manuel had not been idle and managed to gather a large army composed of 15,000 men, which outnumbered Gregorius' 10,000. They met a few miles away from Thebes, and Manuel's numbers seemed to drive the armies to a stalemate. But with majority of his forces attempting to dislodge Gregorius' heavy infantry, Gregorius managed to maneuver his arquebusiers away from the center, and led them to the flanks of Manuel's army, raining devastating volleys of gunfire on them, causing mass panic amongst Manuel's men. When they tried to engage the arquebusiers in combat, they were led away from the battle in a feigned retreat, where, exposed out in the open, they were pounced by Gregorius' cavalry. This act saw a mass retreat unfold in Manuel's army, and Gregorius ordered his men to spare no one, giving them the green light to massacre any prisoners caught. The time for clemency was over. Anyone who had the chance to join him earlier and didn't were dead men. Amidst the chaos, Manuel was able to run away and retreated into Morea, where Mistras was to serve as his final stand. Manuel tried bringing the Venetians into the conflict by promising them some of the holdings in Anatolia, but the Venetians were not able to fight on two fronts, as the crusade had run into some problems following an ambush at Sivas, where Davud Pasha had scattered the crusading forces across Anatolia. With no allies to turn to, Manuel wrote to Gregorius asking for reconciliation, or at least the option of being banished to some monastery somewhere across the Mediterranean, but none of his pleas were answered, resulting in Mistras being placed under siege. Manuel tried to escape under the cover of night, but he was intercepted by Isaac Melodus, who smugly looked at Manuel and laughed, for now it was he who was on the run. Manuel was handed over to Gregorius and he was made to kneel before him and call off his allies who were still putting up a fight in Constantinople. Manuel wrote to Constantinople and ordered the surrender of the city to Gregorius. After Constantinople was formally surrendered, Gregorius had Manuel travel alongside him in chains, and made sure to parade his former rival out in public, asserting his authority over those in the empire. Gregorius had Manuel thrown in jail somewhere in Constantinople, and would frequently visit him, being the only person whom Manuel would see for the rest of his life. Gregorius took the time to reorganize the themes and kept the ones Manuel added, but replaced their governors with loyalists, ensuring his security and control over the empire. In 1486, Gregorius visited his Anatolian provinces and dissolved the committee, establishing a permanent council based in Osakion, with Isaac as his Grand Duke. Throughout the time in Osakion, Gregorius met with his appointed governors and was made aware of a small uprising that occurred due to the harsh taxation of the populace in Iconium. Being a man of good PR, Gregorius had the governor sacked and imprisoned, meeting with his Turkish subjects to make sure something like this would not happen again. As a thanks, one of the farmers affected by this offered his daughter's hand in marriage. Gregorius was amused by the offer and pretended to consider it, having her travel with him throughout his tour of Anatolia. Gregorius did it to garner support from the locals, and made her appear alongside him in public meetings and gatherings. However, what started as an insincere gesture eventually became something genuine. She'd listen to what he had to say and support him in his endeavors, sometimes offering advice on what to do. Though she wasn't very well read, he still felt an attachment and a connection to her that he was unable to form with others throughout his life. Gregorius was torn on what to do going forward. If he ditched her, he'd only push someone who understood him away, and didn't know if he'd ever find someone like her again. But if he married her, which was something the patriarch would prohibit and the people despise, he'd tarnish his reputation, and go against everything he had stood for up to that point. Was it not Lucas Notaras whom he had praised for his policy of putting Romans first? Did he not judge Constantine and Petranus for seeing Turks as equals rather than enemies? Gregorius looked at Ayla, and wondered what he could do to circumvent the rules of marriage in the empire. He tried to get Ayla to convert early on, but she remained firm in her faith. She then attempted to get him to convert to her religion, but he would not budge. In the end, they both chose not to marry, but would remain for all effects and purposes a couple. The following year, Ayla would give birth to twins, one a boy and the other a girl. Gregorius held his son, Sophronius, in his arms. He saw Sophronius stare at him and reach out for him. Gregorius gently grabbed his son's hand and couldn't help but feel proud. He then looked over to his daughter, Akara. She was in her mother's arms and he smiled at them. For the first time in his life, he felt accepted by those close to him. Accepted by his new family, his son, daughter, and wife. They were perhaps the only people who could have warmed his misanthropic heart. He looked at Sophronius and his hands began to tremble. Glimpses of Elinos flooded his mind. He felt guilt and regret for having sent Elinos away that night. But if he hadn't done so, none of the events from the past decade would have transpired, and Gregorius would not have been here right now. Sophronius was baptized and the Caro would be raised a Muslim. Though confused by the arrangement, Isaac would pledge his support for both children, and swore his allegiance to Sophronius, helping find him a tutor to give him the best education in the empire. Gregorius returned to Constantinople and revealed his son to the people, who readily accepted him as the next in line, having been lied to about his mother's origin. The people were told his mother was a devout Christian woman who had followed Gregorius during his crusade, but passed shortly after giving birth. Respecting her wishes, she was buried in her hometown somewhere in Anatolia, and given a discreet funeral. Gregorius spent a good 2 months back in Constantinople getting things back in order. Late into one night in March of 1487, Gregorius was strolling through an indoor garden at the imperial palace. He was approached by one of his servants who handed him a letter from Iconium's governor. The Hungarian captain was requesting aid from the Roman state and army, having been separated from the French contingent of the Crusaders after an encounter with the Wood Pasha left the French captain severely injured and was presumed dead, along with his French soldiers. Gregorius looked at the letter blankly. His hands fell to his side, and he put his head down. Reuben was dead, and Zolan desperate for aid. He sent a letter to Iconium's governor, to give the Hungarians whatever they needed, and to tell Zolan that the Roman army was on its way. Gregorius left Constantinople with Isaac at his side, and Gregorius' army of the damned, his first legion, began their march to Iconium. The men leading the march raised Gregorius' standard, which depicted a word sewn onto the fabric of the flag, the word redemption.